On or about February 2020, while plaintiff was located in the state of Illinois, defendant Grace Pontoppidan initiated a deliberate and malicious campaign of tortious conduct, including assault and harassment, against the plaintiff. The defendant's conduct was continuous, pervasive, and intentional. The defendant applied verbal bombardments and targeted electroacoustic broadcasting to the plaintiff, which plaintiff experienced as torture. The defendant was aware that the plaintiff had been suffering from significant long-term and permanent injuries impacting his well-being and capacity. The defendant's tortious campaign has consisted of a pattern of intentional acts designed to menace the plaintiff, including but not limited to, A. Commencing violence, B. Making credible threats of violence, and C. Engaging in a pattern of unwanted and harassing communications. The defendant ignored requests from co-workers and senior counterparts to stop the alleged conduct. Upon information and belief, defendant engaged in this conduct with the specific intent to cause plaintiff harm or with reckless disregard for the certainty that the defendant's conduct would cause plaintiff severe distress and injury. As a direct and proximate result of the defendant's continuous and intentional acts, plaintiff Joshua James has suffered, and continues to suffer, severe neurological and physiological damages, extreme emotional distress, and a loss of a normal life. The plaintiff made ongoing attempts from 2020 to the present to escape the defendant's conduct by trying to compromise and reason with the defendant. The defendant also commenced physical assault on multiple occasions. In one instance on or about 2023 at an exercise gym. The defendant allegedly planned to have an individual attack the plaintiff by attempting to cause a head injury, following the plaintiff's pleas regarding his poor brain health and prior head injuries. The damage resulting from this conduct has caused psychological harm and physical injury with short-term, long-term, and permanent consequences. The careers and assets of the plaintiff and other individuals related to the plaintiff's work have been harmed as a consequence. The defendant allegedly facilitated tortious and coercive attacks against the plaintiff to prevent him from physically moving to seek refuge in other states and countries, starting in 2020. This allegedly nullified the occupational and business interests of the plaintiff, who had been invited to provide services in other locations. On multiple, separate, and contiguous occasions from February 2020 to the present, defendant has continued the campaign of torts against the plaintiff within the state of Illinois. The defendant allegedly made plans for torts which included outside individuals selected based on their belonging to protected classes, a fact the defendant allegedly made known to the plaintiff on or about 2020 to 2021. When the defendant was notified of the chance of being removed from the environment by external factors, she allegedly facilitated opposition and implied an interest in staying. The defendant knew that the plaintiff had been documenting the defendant's behavior starting in 2020. After such communication failed, the plaintiff pleaded with the defendant on the basis that her actions were jeopardizing public safety. The defendant allegedly intensified negative activity to coercively silence the plaintiff. The defendant made attempts to ignore assessing the scale and severity of the damage resulting from her actions and expressed apathy and a lack of remorse. The defendant repeatedly attempted to encourage negative behavior and negligence through torture, unwanted communication, coercion, and other means, in concert with other individuals. The defendant allegedly punished the plaintiff with retaliation in the form of torture for ignoring her or mitigating her attacks. The defendant allegedly attempted to coerce private information regarding clandestine elements from the plaintiff through torture starting in 2020. This was allegedly deterred by the defendant's superiors. The defendant allegedly attempted to forcefully share private information about clandestine elements using torture during communications starting in 2020. The plaintiff ignored and rejected all attempts to share such information. The defendant repeatedly attempted to communicate about dangerous groups of people and rogue, surreptitious elements with known interests in violence, which the plaintiff rejected interest in, on, or about February 2020. The defendant's pursuits have allegedly led to the family, extended family, and contacts of the plaintiff being threatened, including progeny of the plaintiff on or about October 2024. exposed over 50,000 individuals to media involving the plaintiff being tortured to create and incite further damage to the defendant. Alleged threats were made involving an ultimatum between a group planning to carry out bloodshed and the defendant supporting one of the aforementioned groups, in November 2025. There has also been an attempt by the same group to enforce exile, torture, extortion, and enslavement statedly predicated on genetics as stated by the group repeatedly. This group has also stated an interest in causing the plaintiff to disappear and to join militant interests which the group began noting as far back as 2024. The group has also claimed to have already started progress in these pursuits. One such group allegedly includes individuals who have claimed to organize plans to use authorities to abduct and assault the plaintiff. This group has claimed to organize to perform many of the acts which the defendant previously verbalized intent for to the plaintiff. A dangerous group, which the defendant has intentionally attracted, allegedly disturbs the plaintiff with comments regarding communications regarding a politically involved person known for attacking people, in 2025. The aforementioned dangerous groups have claimed to use the defendant as a model for their own campaigns of attacks in 2025. Individuals from these groups have also claimed to have chosen to invest into attacking the plaintiff for an extended period of time in the same manner which the defendant has done for similarly stated reasons including emotional interest and causing financial harm. Superficial information regarding safety, which the plaintiff attempted to coerce out of the defendant, was conveyed as previously authorized. Recently, one of the aforementioned dangerous groups allegedly took interest in this information and spoke of the plaintiff being interrogated in 2025 with intent to harm. The defendant's co-workers allegedly urged the defendant to stop attacking the plaintiff, with the stated belief that the dangerous groups of people were a valid danger. This started in 2020 and continued into 2024. The plaintiff's prior working relationship with an individual with commercial interest in the healthcare sector was allegedly destroyed as a result of torts from the defendant in 2021. The defendant was aware that the plaintiff and this individual had been planning to work on a scaled distribution scheme of a novel, affordable cancer treatment. The defendant's alleged daily torture and harassment resulted in the plaintiff being unable to maintain the working relationship. The plaintiff became physically sickened as a result of the torture and stress, resulting in long periods where the plaintiff regularly vomited and lost an ability to maintain a proper schedule. The defendant was informed that the plaintiff suffered from pre-existing conditions and injuries. The defendant was aware that the plaintiff had likely contracted the COVID-19 virus at the beginning of the campaign in 2020. The defendant was also aware that the plaintiff suffered from overtraining syndrome. The defendant's torts started while the plaintiff was in distress from the overtraining syndrome, continued through the suspected COVID-19 sickness, and did not stop. The plaintiff also notified the defendant that he had already suffered significant cardiac distress and cardiac arrest as a result of prior assaults. The defendant was aware of the plaintiff's compromised breathing condition and allegedly used this knowledge in plans for further attacks. While in Cook County, the plaintiff made an agreement to travel to assist an elderly relative with driving services in 2020. After traveling, the defendant intentionally facilitated the harassment of the plaintiff and promoted his distraction while driving. This resulted in the plaintiff being regularly exhausted. On a few occasions, this exhaustion rendered the plaintiff unable to safely drive, and the elderly individual drove themselves. In the last instance of this, the defendant allegedly facilitated coercive messaging, such as "don't drive," being broadcast after the plaintiff had awoken following hours of harassment. The plaintiff was too tired to drive safely and allowed the elderly individual to drive. This resulted in a vehicular collision which severely injured both the elderly individual and another individual. The elderly individual incurred a brain bleed. Within days of this incident, the defendant allegedly continued the same coercive messaging. This resulted in the plaintiff returning to Cook County. The defendant's attack on the working capacity of the plaintiff caused dietary distress because the plaintiff lost the ability to afford healthy food as a result in 2020 and 2021. The plaintiff pleaded the defendant on numerous occasions to not be bothered to the extent of occupational dysfunction so that the plaintiff would be able to at least support a proper diet. As a result of the defendant impeding the plaintiff's ability to work, the plaintiff had to choose low-quality food options. This resulted in sickness and the plaintiff eating cheap food items from local establishments which later became involved in food contamination incidents. Symptoms indicative of malnutrition and cardiac disorders. Symptoms that presented during the period in which the plaintiff was consuming this poor diet included an inability to stay awake, extreme lethargy following meals, a constant state of low energy, heart palpitations, dehydration, severe dry mouth, and an increase in heart palpitations beyond the extent caused by the defendant's other actions. The defendant suggested that asthma was responsible for each of these symptoms while ignoring the plaintiff's pleas. The plaintiff was never diagnosed with asthma. Around the times that there were food recall advisories for two different establishments which the plaintiff resorted to eating food from, the plaintiff became ill. This appeared in the form of regular vomiting for days on end to the point that the plaintiff had to sleep on the floor to avoid vomiting in bed after multiple times vomiting in bed. It progressed to the plaintiff having to remain around vessels to catch expelled fluid at all times in order to avoid vomiting on the floor itself. This matched descriptions of food poisoning symptoms relevant to the food recall advisories. Once the plaintiff changed dietary habits enabled by increased resource access resulting from external assistance, these symptoms began to clear up. The defendant ongoingly caused business engagements and working interests to end or suffer as a result, starting in 2021. The defendant is allegedly responsible for the collapse of a business interest. One business suffered a loss worth over $200,000 due to an error created as a result of the plaintiff being forced to work with limited capacity caused by the defendant. The defendant interrupted communications with clients of the plaintiff and also caused losses of devices and data related to business and clients. These losses included evidence of the defendant's actions. The plaintiff was forced to upgrade security for devices and applications related to business due as a practice in good faith once the intrusions were confirmed and required to be recognized. The defendant proceeded to compromise computing systems after the plaintiff's upgrades to security. Count 1. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Plaintiff realleges and incorporates by reference paragraphs 1 through 43 as if fully set forth herein. The defendant's conduct, as described above, constitutes a continuous campaign of harassment and torture that is extreme and outrageous and which goes beyond all possible bounds of decency in a civilized society. Defendant intended to inflict severe emotional distress upon the plaintiff or acted with reckless disregard of the high probability that the defendant's conduct would cause severe emotional distress. As a direct and proximate result of defendant's extreme and outrageous conduct, plaintiff has suffered severe emotional distress, which has manifested in severe neurological and physiological damages. Case No. 2025L062088. Now comes the plaintiff, Joshua James, Pro Se, and respectfully moves this honorable court to enter an order dismissing the above entitled cause of action without prejudice pursuant to Section 2 to 1009 of the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure, 735 ILCS 5/2-1009. In support of this motion, the plaintiff states as follows. This action was commenced by the plaintiff, currently proceeding Pro Se. The plaintiff has made diligent efforts to retain legal counsel to pursue the claims in this matter, particularly to navigate the complex discovery and litigation litigation procedures. The plaintiff has been unable to successfully retain counsel and pursue this matter with the necessary professional diligence due to technical and security issues involving digital communications. Aforementioned communications issues match patterns of past occurrences which have been alleged in the original complaint for this case to originate from the interference of the defendant, Grace Pontoppidan. Aforementioned communications issues have continued as recent as the 26th day of November, 2025. No trial or hearing on the merits has begun in this matter. Plaintiff now intends to voluntarily dismiss the action without prejudice to afford the plaintiff the necessary opportunity to secure new legal counsel and refile the matter with proper representation within the time provided by 735 ILCS 5/13-217. The plaintiff acknowledges that payment of the defendant's court costs is a precondition to voluntary dismissal under 735 ILCS 5/2-1009. The plaintiff is prepared to pay or tender said costs upon the court's order or upon presentment of an itemized bill of costs by the defendant. The dismissal should be without prejudice. As provided for by 735 ILCS 5/2-1009, preserving the plaintiff's right to refile the action against the defendant within the applicable statute of limitations for 1 year, whichever is greater, pursuant to 735 ILCS 5/13-217.